Shift concussion patients out of fight or flight with modern therapies. Stay tuned because today you will discover how to reduce inflammation, stimulate the brainstem, and utilize photobiomodulation for concussion patients. Hi there, I'm Dr. Krista Burns, founder of the American Posture Institute, and your host on the Virtual Neurology Summit. The purpose of the Virtual Neurology Summit is to provide healthcare professionals with brain based solutions so you can get better neuroplastic results with your patients. I'm honored to welcome our next guest expert. Dr. Ryan Cedarmark is a family nurse practitioner, doctor of chiropractic, and a functional neurologist. He's the director of the Neurosolutions Center of Atlanta, helping patients with neurologic conditions, and is the president of the Interdisciplinary Association of Functional Neurosciences and Rehabilitation. Today, he'll be sharing with us strategies for concussion rehab. Dr. Cedarmark, thank you so much for joining us as a speaker on the Virtual Neurology Summit. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. This is a topic I really enjoy learning about and then also teaching. And I've just seen some of the strategies that I've been using help patients who really have no answers when it comes to a mild concussion, but also too with traumatic brain injury. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for concussion and what that looks like in a neuro rehabilitation setting. So nothing about supplements or functional nutrition, functional medicine, just about how we can try to stimulate the brain to build a better brain after concussion. So one of the most interesting things I think that happens after a concussion is the change in the way that the nervous system works. Um, a lot of times what happens is there becomes an imbalance in the nervous system between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So with the fight or flight response, usually you want to have a fight or flight response that can activate when we need it to activate and then relax when we need it to relax. It's really important. Our sympathetic nervous system does so many important things. But the problem is when it becomes there's an over dominance in the way that it's working. And with concussion, it almost seems like the brain and body start to shift towards fight or flight and that sympathetic nervous system side of things. And then it just gets stuck there. And the parasympathetic rest and digest can't balance it back out. So one of our goals is to figure out a way that we can change the brain. And the reason that that is important is because everything we do in functional neuroscience is we try to build positive neuroplasticity. So going back to that quick example, when you have a concussion and if someone has lingering post-concussion symptoms, that's actually an example of what's called negative neuroplasticity. So the brain and body has adapted to a negative input and then it gets stuck there. And what's happening over time is it's building a bad habit. So when I speak with patients who've had concussion and they've been everywhere and they're not getting the right answers, they're not seeing improvement, I try to remind the patients, hey, all we're trying to do is to teach the brain and body a new habit, a better habit, so we can override these bad habits that it just learned from that concussion. And the reason that's important is if you can start to shift the nervous system into more of a balanced state, so not a nervous system that's just always chilling out, but one that can kind of shift back and forth between sympathetic and parasympathetic tone, that creates optimal opportunities to build positive neuroplasticity. It's really, really hard to make positive changes to the brain and to the body when it's stuck in like a fight, flight, or freeze response. And this is just something, it makes so much sense to me. And like with everything I've done in studying and working with patients, when that came to fruition, it seemed like it was common sense. And I kind of hit myself on the head like, oh man. But I still think a lot of times people are doing concussion therapy. So they're doing physical types of therapy, vestibular types of therapy, but their nervous system is still stuck in a fight or flight. So they may feel good at the time of the therapy, but then afterwards they go back because of that negative neuroplastic state. The other reason for this is anytime there's a stress consequence, what happens in the short term and then eventually in the long term is the prefrontal cortex begins to shut down. So you almost lose conscious control of overriding emotions, overriding feelings, overriding anything in the body because the lower parts of the brain start to take over. So this is just a really cool picture. It's from a great research article that talks about the consequences of chronic stress exposure on the brain. And what it tells us is that we basically lose our ability to hit the brakes. So the prefrontal cortex kind of goes offline, and the lower parts of the brain, like an emotional regulation area called the amygdala, begins to take over. So the reason that's important is you can't, it's really hard to think your way out of a concussion. You have to be able to build strategies to help allow the stress response to reduce and then allow the bigger parts of the brain to take over. I really like that image. That's why I wanted to share that with you guys. So if we're looking at concussion from kind of like a 3-step protocol for changing the nervous system, changing the brain, changing the body, step one would be to shift away from a fight, flight, freeze response. Again, the goal with this is to try to lay the foundation to build positive neuroplasticity. A lot of times in concussion, it can change the way that we breathe, right? We oftentimes don't ever have to think about how we're breathing or are breathing at all throughout the day, but it can shift us from a more diaphragmatic belly breath to a more rib cage sympathetic breath. So one way to stimulate conscious control, so stimulate the front part of the brain and stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, is to do controlled breathing exercises. And there are several different kinds out there. The simplest place to start for anyone is, this is from a website called exhalr.com, and you can program the breath. It's a free website. You can program the type of breath you want to do. There's box breathing. There's different types of like yoga breathing exercises on there. But this is a simple small inhale. So four count inhale and then 6 count exhale. Inhaling through the nose will help improve nitric oxide production. Humming on your exhalation will help improve vagal tone. That's just kind of like a one-up on that. And in doing that, you also want to find strategies to stimulate the vagus nerve. I'm a huge fan of cold exposure now. So there's different types of cold exposure for people. You have to make sure that you're a candidate for it and it won't drive you into oversympathetic dominance, because what it does is it can stimulate the sympathetic response, but then it can kind of like cancel it out in a sense. Working on long exhalations, singing loud and proud for all to hear. One thing that happens in concussion, and I see this all the time in kids, which is super depressing, they're told to kind of sit still, relax, don't go to school, don't go to your activities. You're basically on the sidelines and you're missing the social connection. And based on the polyvagal theory by Dr. Stephen Porges, social engagement is so important for proper vagal tone. So you want to make sure that you're still hanging out, talking to loved ones, and having a good time, even though you're not feeling great. There's studies that show that fasting and intermittent fasting can help improve vagal tone. And then the one thing we do in the office a ton is we stimulate the vagus nerve electrically using bioelectric stimulation. So step one, shift away from fight, flight, or freeze. Step two is modulate inflammation and improve cellular function. I think the simplest, most non-invasive way to do this, and this is how we do it in the office, is using some sort of red light device. I truly think that red light therapy is still a very new therapy. And my hope is that more standardized, it becomes more of a standardized therapy throughout lots of clinics in the world. But I've just seen so many positive changes using laser devices, red light devices on all different types of symptoms, especially with concussion. And I think part of the reason for that is it helps reduce inflammation. It can improve ATP production. It can improve nerve growth factors. It can improve the opportunity to build neuroplasticity by changing the internal environment of the brain and body. One of the most interesting things that I've recently learned about red light therapy and its stimulation on the cells, because the way it works is all of our little cells have little solar panels and they can convert red light energy into cell energy by producing ATP. But if the environment is scary, so like if there's a lot of inflammation happening in the cellular environment, the mitochondria are actually extremely intelligent. They're not just little muscle men and women working hard. They also survey the land. And if the land is not safe, so if it's not a safe environment for them to go to work, they won't go to work. So you have to reduce the inflammation, create a more hospitable environment for the mitochondria to work, and then they can go back to work. So that's one of the reasons I love using red light in the clinic. We use it on the brain, on the body to help improve all different sorts of symptoms, but especially like the most common symptoms in concussion, like light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, headache, all those things. So this is from a research paper, and then I just made this. I like to make little things to post on Instagram, so it just tells you a little bit about other things that red light therapy can do. And then step three, which is another kind of like new area that I'm really interested in, especially with concussion, is stimulation of the brainstem and then its neighbor, the cerebellum and vestibular system. Now, this is really cool. I think working on I've never seen a concussion where balance hasn't been an issue. So like some sort of balance has been disrupted. Even in elite athletes like gymnasts and hockey players, people who should be able to do balance exercises with their eyes closed and doing like 100 other things, no one really assesses their balance in a mild concussion. So looking at balance and then doing specific exercises to stimulate balance can have a profound impact on concussion symptoms. After you've improved vagal tone, reduce the fight or flight response, and improve the inflammation. This is a really cool study from 2022 that looked at whole body vibration. So I know a lot of practitioners and patients are using whole body vibration, but I really enjoyed reading this article because it actually talked about how it can reduce brain inflammation and really help with cellular function just by standing on a vibration plate. So what we do in the clinic is we'll have patients stand on a vibration plate and do different types of balance exercises while we're using red light therapy. And then also while we're doing stimulation to the brainstem, two specific areas we'll typically stimulate are the vagus nerve, and then a newer area that's kind of in the research now is the trigeminal nerve, which I know a lot of practitioners are familiar with. But doing electrical stimulation to the trigeminal nerve in the research shows that you can improve cerebral blood flow, improve oxygen to the brain, reduce inflammation, and then increase nerve growth factors. So kind of like what you can do with vagus nerve, but just doing it differently through the trigeminal system. And that's all brainstem stimulation. So looking at those middle and top parts of the brain. Last but not least, I think an underchecked area that people should look into. Oh, I'm sorry, not last but not least. This is really interesting too. So the last brainstem stimulation that we do in the clinic, which is a little bit out there, but tongue stimulation. So there's a couple of really neat papers that show that stimulating the tongue, and people who are interested in neuroplasticity, I'm sure they've all heard of Paul Bach-y-Rita. He's done a lot of work on this topic, but now they're using it to improve balance outcomes and gait retraining, so walking retraining by electrically stimulating the tongue. There was a paper on a military personnel who had a severe traumatic brain injury, did tons of physical therapy, made great gains, but then plateaued. And it wasn't until they started co-activating his system with electrical tongue stimulation that his balance and walking got better. So it's really neat. I say like the tongue is kind of like the highway into the brainstem, into the brain. So just another modality to stimulate brainstem and stimulate brain in concussion. Last but not least, this was really interesting to me, primitive reflexes. So I know usually, when you hear primitive reflexes, you think of newborns. So with primitive reflexes, those typically, as the bigger parts of the brain develop, those primitive reflexes will go into hibernation. So I never say they go away, because if there is some sort of stressful or traumatic event to the nervous system, those primitive reflexes can re-emerge and they can hinder further neurological growth and development and change. So if you're trying to build positive neuroplasticity in someone who's had a brain injury or concussion, it's always important to assess to see if there's a re-emergence of primitive reflexes that have decided to come out of hibernation, and then work with someone to do specific physical exercises to put them back into hibernation. One, for example, this is from a physical therapy research paper that showed common primitive reflexes associated with brain injuries and concussions. One that I found that's just more makes sense, right? That's like fight or flight or freeze response, but the TLR. So I've had people who are supposed to be really good at balance do a TLR, which will stand them with their feet together in a Romberg's or balance position, tilt their head back, and then their world just goes nuts. And all we do are simple exercises to help stimulate the tonic labyrinthine reflex, and a lot of their symptoms get better. So just something I wanted to end and put on people's radar. If you're working with concussion as a practitioner, or if you're a patient with concussion, this is something that you should look into to see if those are present, if they've come out of hibernation, if they've reemerged, and then there's simple exercises that you can go into to put them back into hibernation so the bigger brain can continue to do its thing. That's pretty much all I have. I really do think that a lot of this stuff is still in its infancy in rehabilitation, and I think it is the future of rehabilitating a brain that the patients just don't have the answers for. So for patients, we'd love to offer a free 20-minute discovery call at our clinic, see if we're a right fit for you. Would love to help any way we can. And for practitioners, if you're interested, I spoke with the laser company and they're more than happy to offer this to all the listeners. If you're interested in getting involved with laser therapy, you can always reach out to me. This is the StimPod device, which we use for bioelectric stimulation to the trigeminal nerve and to the ear and to the tongue and other parts of the body. So I just want to say thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Cedarmark. And thank you for this great opportunity for practitioners to definitely take advantage of. So be sure to click over and see how you can take advantage of this great opportunity to start working with laser within your practice. All right, I'm going to go through a summary and then a Q&A. So you talked to us about strategies for concussion from a neurorehabilitation perspective. So how does a concussion affect the nervous system? It leads to an imbalance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So we want the sympathetic nervous system to activate when we need it to activate. However, when it's overdominant, it can become problematic, which we see with concussion. The patient tends to get stuck in that sympathetic nervous system. And then with neuroplasticity, we always want to be building positive neuroplasticity. If we're not building positive neuroplasticity, something's impacting, resulting in negative neuroplasticity. So the process requires a nervous system that's not stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, and patterns of behavior that are repeated become automatic. So every thought, feeling, or action that we engage in triggers thousands of neurons that join together to form neural networks. Stress shuts down conscious control. So chronic stress exposure weakens the prefrontal cortex, leading to a loss of control of emotions and behaviors. The amygdala truly takes over. And I like how you mentioned you can't think your way out of a concussion because logically you may be trying to think your way out, but truly the amygdala has taken over. So we need to reduce that stress response. And you shared with us 3 great steps to achieve that. So step number 1, shift away from fight, flight, freeze for positive neuroplasticity. So doing things like cold exposure to stimulate and then cancel out the sympathetic nervous system response, doing long exhalations to increase HRV, seeking, having social connection. Another great point that when it comes to, somebody sitting on the sidelines after concussion, we need to make sure that they have enough brain rest, obviously, before going back in for play, but they're missing those social connections that they so much crave that's associated with a sport or with an activity that may have actually led to the concussion. So don't miss out on those social connections. And then also fasting, as well as transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation. Step number 2, modulate inflammation and improve cell function. Red light therapy being a great opportunity. So it helps create neurogenesis, increase ATP production, changes the internal environment of the brain and the body, reduction in reactive oxygen species, and improved neuronal communication between brain networks. Really phenomenal treatment. And then step number 3, stimulate brainstem and balance centers. So whole body vibration attenuates brain damage and neuroinflammation following a traumatic brain injury. A study that you shared shows it alleviates brain inflammation and improves cellular function and improves cognitive and motor function. With the neuroprotective effects of trigeminal nerve stimulation to help improve oxygenation to the brain and increase nerve growth factor, and then doing that brainstem activation. And then you shared with us so phenomenal tongue stimulation. So stimulating the tongue, how it improves balance and gait. It's really a highway to the brain. And then primitive reflex remediation exercises. So primitive reflexes, and again, thanks for explaining it like this, they go into hibernation. So they don't disappear, but they go into hibernation. And we ultimately want to keep them in hibernation, but they can reemerge and inhibit positive neuroplasticity, for example, after concussion. So do exercises to put them back into hibernation for best management for the patient. So stimulating the tonic labyrinthine reflex, and to test the TLR, have the patient stand in Romberg's and then tilt the head back and watch how their response is. And even high-level athletes will still have problems with balance after concussion. We can't forget about this important key piece when it comes to rehabilitation. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. A couple questions for you. Now, when you're working with a concussion patient, how long after the concussion would you consider it to be best practices to start doing neurorehabilitation? Right away or let them rest a little bit? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, honestly, I think the sooner the better. And that's changed. Like the old adage was like rest until you start to feel better, then seek therapy. But as soon as you can, because again, just based on the principles of neuroplasticity, you can go into negative neuroplasticity or positive. If you can get in and stop and start to shift, then you're in a good place.
Wonderful. And how about stacking red light therapy? Do you have them doing exercises while doing red light therapy or just focusing on actually downregulating the nervous system while doing red light therapy? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, usually, so we always say we co-activate. So if we're trying to do a balance exercise, it's going to stimulate the balance centers. We'll typically have a specific wavelength of light shining on the balance centers while they're doing it.
Wonderful.
A little bit of both, though.
Yeah, for sure. And what would you say to patients who have been exhibiting mood changes post concussion? They seem to be stuck in that amygdala activation, and maybe they have kind of a poor mood towards doing their therapies and getting better. They have catastrophization. They don't know if they'll ever come out of this. What would you say to help them have to be encouraged to follow through with their treatment plans?
Okay, so this might sound a little zany, but we'll have because I've ran through the situation before. Sometimes your brain can't tell the difference between reality and what's not real. And before a concussion, our nervous system, we have a negativity bias, so we're going to go to what keeps us safe. I think it's really important for people after a concussion to guide their mind on where they want to be and be as specific as possible. So if you're stuck, and I know this might sound a little shaky to people, but this works so good. You have to close your eyes and you have to see yourself where you want to be at a certain period in time. So I didn't mention this, but one of the things we have all of our concussion patients do is write down their short and long-term goals. If you're a gymnast, when do you want to start back? Like, when do you want to do your first flip? What's the exact date? What are you wearing when you're doing that flip? Where are you? Who's watching? What does it smell like in there? Be as specific as possible and guide the brain. I always tell patients too, like, if you're a captain of a ship, you're not going to just set sail without a map, right? You have to give your brain a map to where it needs to go, or else you can get stuck on that mouse wheel.
Yeah. Such a great point. Thanks for mentioning that. And I like how you mentioned giving them a map, having them visualize, actually see themselves getting the result where they want to be, writing it down, and then not only having the cognitive attention to it, but then being committed to that goal. Because our brains are designed to keep us safe. They're not designed for enhanced performance. And as much as we all want to have enhanced performance, that negativity bias can take over and then they can be stuck in this amygdala reactions. So really great point when it comes to managing the patient's expectations, but also helping encourage them to stay compliant with their treatment protocols. Wonderful. Thank you again so
Yeah.
much. And as
Yeah.
we
Thank
wrap
you.
up, another great session today on the Virtual Neurology Summit. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Cedarmark for his excellent work in functional neurology. And to all of our viewers, I'd like to acknowledge you. Thank you for your commitment to brain-based correction and objective clinical results. I'm Dr. Krista, your host on the Virtual Neurology Summit. Be sure to check out the Postural Neurology program to get certified in brain-based postural correction. Stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next Neuromasterclass of the Virtual Neurology Summit.